So before I get started this evening, I just want to start with a couple of thanks. And so one of them is that, yes, Dr. Adam Muller and I did meet at a conference, and so I thank him very much for bringing me to the attention of the Mauro Institute, and then to Dr. Charlotte Enns for the invitation. And then Jason Brennan has been phenomenal in making the arrangements for me to get here, so thank you, Mr. Brennan. And then also, of course, our rector, Dr. Chris Adams, so thank you so much for having me. So I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm also a full-service academic, so after this lecture, I will do it again in French, for those of you who would like to stay for that. And I also wore the same outfit as what's on the poster to make sure you could find me. So you can do a double take. Yes, it's the same outfit. So what I will be doing this evening is looking at this intersection between genocide and religion. So let me just give you a quick background, and then we'll look at some of the points that we're going to be covering this evening. So I actually am trained, as Dr. Enns said, as a comparative religious ethicist. So the way that I came to this area of study is that I noticed in looking at human rights violations, at human rights issues, such as things like warfare, for instance, which often are the culprit of many human rights violations. And as many of you know, genocides tend to happen alongside wars. And so in doing a lot of my work and looking at human rights, I noticed that religion, religious actors, institutions, religious ideology would often attend many of these genocidal conflicts. Yet, there were very few scholars of religion whose area of study was genocide. And so it turns out that I'm actually one of a handful of people in the world who actually study genocide, who are trained in the area of religion. And so I thought that this would be an important topic for us to talk about. I think that scholars of religion are very late to the table in looking at a lot of these issues. And it also just turned out to be an area that's unfortunately a growth area of research. So in the 90s, for those of you who may be interested in looking at other works, there's a gentleman named Michael Sells that published a book called The Bridge Portrayed, looking at specifically the role of religion in the Bosnian genocide. And so from what I can understand, this was kind of the beginning of what would start to be a kind of wave of interest in specifically looking at how religion attended genocidal conflicts. So this is in 96. But then we start to see this uptick of publications that start coming out in the 2000s. So this is only 2020, right? So we're talking relatively recently. And so in 2000 and up to the present day, there's been another handful of publications. So for instance, we see Aryan Jesus, which is by Susanna Heschel, looking at Nazi ideology and this concept of Aryanizing Jesus Christ. We see another piece by Stephen Jacobs. This came out in 2009, which was looking at confronting genocide and looking at the Abrahamic religions and their complicity in genocide. We also see another piece by Timothy Longman. This comes out in 2009 about Christianity and the churches in Rwanda. Right? So we have these pieces that start coming out. A volume that was comparative was by Omer Bartov and by Phyllis Mack called In God's Name. That one came out in 2001, right? So as you can see, these are all in the 2000s with the exception of this piece by Sells. So as we start to see this kind of uptick, if you will, in these publications, we also started to see this interest by several government organizations and non-governmental organizations in specifically involving religious actors in genocide prevention and forecasting. So this is also relatively recent. So just down the road at McGill University, Christopher Tuckwood wrote a piece about a conference there that was on global genocide prevention. And he observes, and this is in 2007, and he observes that there's a lot of religious talk that attended this particular event. But yet there were very few religious actors or people that were in the room that could then take part in that conversation. So since then, 2007, up until the present, I start to notice people starting to take more interest in specifically looking at religious actors. And so before I get into the presentation, the last couple of things I'll share with you, and this is specifically related to the presentation, is that, for instance, this summer and the summer before, for the first time, the State Department had a ministerial looking at religious freedom that was meant to actually look at how religious actors can be involved in mass violence prevention, right? So this was just this summer and the summer before for the very first time. And then we also have what's called the Fez process, which started in Morocco. And it's going to be the basis of a document I'm going to share with you today, whereby the UN, the Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, started to take an active role in involving religious actors in genocide prevention. This report just came out in 2017. So as you can see by what I've shared with you, this is a pretty recent kind of phenomenon in looking specifically at the role of religion in these conflicts, not only in the sense of potentiating them, but also in a role of perhaps preventing them. So that's the kind of context in which I'm coming to you this evening. So this is still a developing area, if you will. And so what I'm sharing with you is some early research that I've done and looking at the different ways in which we might think about genocide and religion interacting with each other. So one picture I would like to show you, and this was also on the promotional materials that you saw, is this image. So in 2017, in January, there is a piece that appears on the US News website for the UN that reads, "Religious leaders deserve full support in quest for peace," says UN advisor on genocide prevention, right? So this is just in 2017. Notice anything peculiar about this image?
They're all facing that way.
They're all facing away from you, right? So you don't see their faces. But even without being able to see their faces, does there seem to be anything peculiar about this image? And this will be a later critique that comes up. They all appear to be men. Exactly. And when we look at conflicts, when we look at genocide, all of us probably know that women and children are often disproportionately affected by warfare and genocide. Yet, in involving people in the quest for peace, they're often not at the table. So even on the very website of the UN, which is trying to actively involve more actors, including women, in their efforts, we still have this image that's actually announcing the report. So this is the obligatory, these are the ways in which I'm going to define these terms in this lecture slide. I'm not going to spend much time on it, only to say that when I talk about religion and when I talk about genocide, I'm adopting the UN Convention's definition from 1948. So as you can see there, it means any of the following acts that are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, and then it enumerates some of those particular acts. So far as how I'm understanding religion, I have a PhD in religion. This debate has still not, probably will not be resolved as to how we define religion and what we mean by it. But for the purpose of this lecture, suffice it to say I'm talking about what we often refer to as traditional religions. And in this is the sense, if any of you have ever taken a Religions of the World course, right? What we typically see as traditional persistent religions that have large communities that are kind of coalescing around them. And so this is what I mean by religions. So again, in looking at much of the literature on genocide and religion, something that I noticed is that there tended to be skewed attention to what I call the R over here, which are things like people who participated in rescue, like hero stories, right, which we all love, or issues of resistance and resilience, which there are plenty of cases, for instance, in the Holocaust, right, we celebrate heroes of Yad Vashem, right, we celebrate people who actually intervene. We also have quite a few religious actors who are often involved in relief services. So after post-conflict, right, after a genocide, you'll often have religious organizations that come in to help with relief efforts. And then you also have these reconciliation efforts. Probably Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are the ones with which most of you are familiar, and that often also will involve religious actors. So there seemed to be a lot of literature looking at some of these instances. But as I mentioned to you a moment ago, it's only been recently, starting with, say, the 90s and into the 2000s, that I feel as though scholars have been looking more at not just how religious actors and institutions and ideology have actually been kind of bulwarks against violence and genocide, but how in some ways they've actually been complicit or potentiated genocide. And so that's what I have as the 3 Ps here. I love alliteration. So yes, that is very purposeful. And so here you have perpetration, right? So religious actors who are actually involved in committing genocide or inciting genocide. And then we also are seeing more literature on prediction, right? So how can we involve religious actors in being able to forecast when a genocide may be on the horizon? And then how can we actually build more resilient communities as a way of preventing genocides in the first place, right? So we're starting to see more literature moving maybe in that direction. And for a long time, there's a gentleman named Erickson who wrote a piece that came out in 2007, and you can find it on the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum website, where he talks about complicity of the churches in the Holocaust. And he noticed that there was this shift kind of maybe in the 3 decades after World War II, right? So 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, where there was just this kind of implicit, intuitive understanding that religious actors had very little to do with what happened in the Holocaust, and there was a shift that happened about another 30 years after that, which leads us up roughly to about where we are now. And I think in some ways you see that shift maybe even mirrored in now genocide studies, which of course grew out of Holocaust studies in the 80s. And so I think we're starting to see a little bit of that shift in the literature as a result, literature which I'm actually also trying to contribute to. So the way in which I'm trying to do this is looking kind of at a swath of studies in the sense of not only actual conflicts, but also looking at literature that looks at religion and violence and its intersections. And in doing this, it seemed to me that there's this kind of typology, if you will, that kind of fell out of a lot of these conflicts, so far as how religion was involved in genocidal acts, or in genocides more specifically. And the reason why I was interested in doing this is because I wanted to see how that relationship could be reverse engineered. So if we have these conflicts, and again, some of you may be familiar with the book, The Problem from Hell, and she's also the head, this is by Powers, and she's also the head of the Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C., is that unfortunately within these last decades, religion has had a very salient and prominent role in many of the conflicts that we've seen in the last decades. And so that being the case, I was trying to figure out, well, how can we reverse engineer that relationship? Because obviously the kind of moral power and leverage that many religious actors and institutions have can be used for other purposes. And so at first I looked at, well, how do they seem to be most involved? And so one seems to be in othering, right? So we often have religious actors in institutions, or there may be religious ideologies that contribute to what we call othering, which is this idea of making somebody or a whole community so radically different from yourself that they can actually become an object of extirpation. And so falling outside the circle of religious and kind of moral regard allows me then to treat you as other than a human being. And we often hear dehumanization as another way of looking at this, right? Referring to people as cockroaches, like in the case of the Rwandan genocide, or in the case of what we're seeing right now in Myanmar with the 969 movement and calling the Rohingya dogs, right? So that kind of othering. We also have justification, so providing a reason that necessitates that extermination. So oftentimes, genocides are, say, conflicts over resources, right? Or maybe some kind of political upheaval. It's not typical that religion is the motivating or driving factor, right? So it's not usually the motivating factor. Usually it's a very, very kind of dangerous synergistic partner in genocide once it's undertaken by a particular government or group. And so what then happens is that after that's then underway, you'll often have justifications beyond just a conflict over resources that can be used as a way to convince the larger community that this particular persecution needs to happen. So for instance, an example of this might be from the Rwandan genocide in '94, which was this idea that the Tutsi minority was posing a threat to the rest of the community, and that they were literally what were called blocked beings. And this is based on a concept called Imana. So Imana is this kind of fecundating fluid, if you will, that comes from the heavens, that then flows through the king and then to the rest of the people. And so many of you are probably familiar with this idea that kings and queens often represent the health of the community. And so that king is a conduit for this Imana, right, for this wealth that's then bestowed upon the people. And so one of the reasons, and this is according to Taylor, why we may have seen people in the Rwandan genocide impaled, for instance, and I apologize, about to say something rather graphic, impaled from vagina to mouth or from anus to mouth, was because it was a way of showing that they were blocked beings, right? That the Tutsis were somehow blocking this flow to the rest of the community and were a danger not only to the Rwandan economy, but to the very existence of other Rwandans, right? So you have this idea that it goes just beyond the economic conflict. This is actually about a contestation for who is and is not worthy of existence, and to the literal health of the entire polity because of this one group that's seen as a threat. And then last, you have authorization, which is sanctioning otherwise forbidden behavior. So for instance, in the name of X, right, sometimes religious ideas and ideology can go beyond what we might consider moral behavior for the sake of some kind of higher cause. And so you may have support from religious institutions and individuals that allow people to act on these genocidal impulses. One class that I teach is called Religious Perspectives on the Holocaust. And so this is just one very small example, but one of the people we talk about is a guy named Franz Stangl, who was a commandant and at a camp, and is written by Geta Sereni. And he indicates in that piece, like, the church was going along with it, and it just seemed, as though there wasn't anybody stopping us, and it was being affirmed by those people, right? So there's this sense that you can have then moral people who are considered typically moral paragons, right, who are willing then to go along with it as kind of authorizing or sanctioning what's happening, right? So it seemed as though in looking again at these different conflicts, Bosnia and Rwanda, the Holocaust, looking at Myanmar, look at Bangladesh, right? Looking at these different conflicts, there seemed to be some overriding kind of themes that shook out from that. So if that's the case, if we want to work with that idea, then I wanted to see, okay, if these are the most salient ways in which religion seems to intersect with genocide, othering, justification, and authorization, then how can I then use this as a way, again, of reverse engineering that relationship, right? How can we use the same kind of moral authority, if you will, and the leveraging of religious institutions and individuals to actually stymie genocide or to prevent it altogether? And so what I did is one way of kind of trying to actualize or to use this typology in a way that may be useful. I said, okay, again, we're starting to see this uptick. People being interested, people like the United Nations, for instance, being interested in specifically involving religious actors in genocide prevention. And so what I'm going to do this evening, very briefly, is look at two reports that have come out that have a list of the ways in which they think that religious actors can be involved in genocide prevention. And then I want to see, based on these typologies of othering, justification, and authorization, if they seem to attend to what my research seems to have fallen out as being the most destructive ways in which genocide and religion intersect. So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time doing this evening. So for the sake of intellectual honesty, these are the recommendations. So it's pretty tiny. I don't expect you to be able to read it. Again, intellectual honesty. I just want to show them to you. And if you ever want to be able to actually look them up for yourself, this one is called Averting Hell on Earth. This is actually written by Powers, who I mentioned before. Averting Hell on Earth, Religion and Prevention of Genocide. So this came out in 2010. And again, it's put out by the United States Institute of Peace. So if you actually just Google like averting hell on earth, I'm sure the UN report will pop up and you can read it in more detail, right? So there are 8 recommendations there. So for those of you, especially who are kind of toward the back, for instance, one of them reads, number 1 reads, monitor dynamics in the religious sector as one way of involving religious actors in genocide prevention. Another one, number 6, reads, nurture pluralism by promoting active engagement between religions. And then another one is number 4, to train local religious leadership in conflict resolution and management, right? So these are some of the recommendations. A second one that came out more recently was actually put out by the UN. So this is from the Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. So this was a part of something that I mentioned earlier, which is the FEZ process. And it's called that because it started in Morocco. And so it was a series of meetings between religious actors that started in Morocco over several years, trying to talk to religious actors about how they thought they could be involved in genocide prevention efforts. So the outcome of all those meetings is this document. So this document was printed in, I believe it was November of 2017. And here they have 9 recommendations. So the one before had 8, this one has 9. And the UN office actually broke up these 9 into 3 categories. So one is what they call to prevent, one is called to strengthen, what they see as mechanisms that are in place that could help with the prevention of genocide, and then one is to build infrastructure that isn't already there, right? So those are the kind of the 3 categories. So just to give you, again, a quick flavor of what's here. So for instance, from prevent, it has prevent incitement to violent extremism. One from the strengthen category is to foster interfaith and intra-faith dialogue. And then from build, it has build peaceful, inclusive, and just societies through respecting, protecting, and promoting human rights. Okay, so that's, again, a sampling from that one. So in looking at these, I was able to actually talk to people who've been involved in this process, right? So I, as Dr. N shared, I'm at Montclair State University, which is only about 20 miles away from New York City, where the UN headquarters are. So I was able to talk to some people there and to talk to other people who've been involved in this FEST process. And so in doing that and in doing my own research, for our purposes here this evening, I just kind of highlighted, for instance, 3 kind of critiques that have come out of this process, and then of course that also found their way into the reports. So one of them is inadequate input from target audiences. So as you saw earlier, there's that picture that had all men in it. So part of the problem is that despite the UN's efforts in trying to attract women, if you try to attract women who are leaders, who are from religious organizations, do you think you're going to come up with a lot of people? No, right? So there are a lot of religious traditions that don't allow women to occupy roles of authority and leadership. So part of the grumbling, if you will, of many of the people that were involved was that, yes, they actually were able to attract a decent number of women to this process, right, to these meetings, but they weren't the people that were in the room that they felt could actually make change once it actually needed to happen, because they weren't the religious leaders. And so this was one kind of point of contention amongst many of the people that attended. Another one is that some of the recommendations are very kind of broad and seen as being very unrealistic. So even though the plan is a plan for religious actors to help, prevent the incitement, of mass atrocities that could lead to these crimes, it really, if you read the report, the entire report, almost all of it actually is about people other than religious actors. So if you're a religious actor who's taking up this document saying, okay, this is a way in which I can tangibly, kind of forward efforts, that might help stop, the incitement to violence, it's not in there, right? It really is kind of geared toward other actors, and religion is kind of peripherally involved. And so there are kind of these broad expectations of things like foster peace, or these broad expectations that kind of monitor hate rhetoric. But other than that, it really is about doing things that are really outside the training of expertise of many religious actors. And then last, there's a tension with kind of human rights law. So people who work in human rights law get really nervous when they see documents like this, and it's for several reasons. So one of them is that human rights law tends to bind state actors to each other, right? But it's not about individuals as state actors. So when you start involving individuals, especially people who are outside of any kind of official capacity with the state, human rights people start getting a little nervous, right? Second is that there is this concern that by focusing too much on individuals, religious actors being some of them, that you'll somehow send the message that states can abdicate their responsibility to actually protect people. And then a third one is that if you do kind of have religious actors involved in kind of more high-profile efforts to foster peace or to stop genocide or to try to report anything that they see that might lead to some kind of atrocity crime, is that they themselves could become targets by the government, right? So there have been some concerns about this kind of project and what that might mean in the future going forward from a legal standpoint, but also so far as protecting the people that are involved in this process. When I talked to one of the officers that's with the Office of the United Nations on the Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, one of the questions I asked her name's Christiani, Susan Christiani, was, so is there any kind of direct reporting line, or is there some kind of way if a person who's a part of this process, say, needed help, like how would they do that? And they're like, no, there really is no channel for that. So you want them to be able to gather this information, but there really isn't any coordinated way for that information to be shared, right? So some of these things are kind of still, if you will, developing. So I'm nearing toward the end of my presentation because I want us to have time for questions. But when it comes to religion and genocide prevention and seeing how some of these recommendations, if you will, stack up to some of the research that I've done, it appears in looking both at Averting Hell on Earth, 2010, and looking at this more recent document from 2017 by the Plan of Action for Religious Actors, looking at the othering, justification, and authorization pieces that I've offered to you today, it seems as though largely these documents do attend to othering, right? And they typically do this through interreligious dialogue. So there's a lot of interreligious dialogue going on, right? People coming together and talking. And there's a lot of involvement of young people in this process as well. So you do see this attending to, trying to introduce people in intimate spaces and interactions to people of different religious traditions as a way of hoping that should violence break out, that there'll be less likely to be tensions. Now, of course, we've seen through other conflicts that this doesn't always work, right? Neighbors turn on neighbors all the time. But the hope is that this could at least make it less likely. So it seems as though documents are very attuned, to this concept of making sure people have these opportunities to talk to each other from different religious traditions. So in that sense, they get the green arrow going up, right? Doing a good job. That seems to be something that's really at the forefront of a lot of their work. And looking at justification, from what I can see in looking at these recommendations, they seem to be addressing it, but maybe not as much as they should, or they're doing it rather obliquely if they are. And so here, in looking at the genocidal potential of exclusivity, for instance, in different dogma and theology, there doesn't seem as much of emphasis on that. There was this reference to extremism, right? So that is important. But one thing that it tends to kind of ignore, and this is something that I've seen several people, for instance, at the US State Department and other people say, is that some religious traditions themselves, not all, but many religious traditions themselves have dogma that lends itself to a kind of exclusivity, right? Even if it's not overtly something that's meant to cause harm to another. And so there's this emphasis on the extremists, right? There's this emphasis on all these people who are misusing religion. But religion in and of itself, right, so far as some of the dogma that it contains, can lend itself to this kind of exclusivity that I think we also need to be talking about. And so it's not just about inter-religious dialogue. I think there is more need for intra-religious dialogue, right? What are we doing within our own traditions, seemingly that is innocuous, right? That actually can lend itself to violence. That's not necessarily extremist or necessarily even a misuse of the tradition. And then last, when it comes to authorization, I don't really see much attention to that element, which is looking at the alignment of religious actors and institutions within governments. So for instance, we've seen a report that came out, I believe it's in the last 2 years, who is a rapporteur on religious freedom or belief. This is Shahid. And in that report, which is very helpful, he looks at the relationships between certain governments and religious communities. And as you might well guess, there's this kind of Goldilocks, if you will, kind of relationship, that's just right between governments and between religious communities that can help both of them thrive. So if you have a government, for instance, that's very anti-religious, right, that can lead to tensions. And then if you have one that's too closely aligned with the religious tradition, then that also can lead to tension and persecution. So you typically want some kind of, again, like Goldilocks, just right kind of relationship between the two. And I'm not quite sure these reports really take that into account, that regardless of the religious actors that you might have in some of these communities, depending on how close that relationship is to any particular state or government kind of organization, can make it very difficult to actually make much change. And then we also have, in some traditions, people who are just morally compromised from prior conflicts. So there's a lot of emphasis put on the moral sway and the influence that religious actors have, which they do. But you also have some communities who have moved away from those traditions or who are kind of suspicious of their religious institutions and actors in their communities because of past kind of implications or complicity within atrocities, right? So, and I'm not sure that the report actually takes that into account as well, right? The compromised authority of some of the people that they're trying to involve in these peace efforts. So where do we kind of go from here? And I certainly don't have any kind of magic bullet answer to this. But I guess what I will share, and again, this is, I'm relying in some ways on my interview with Ms. Cruciani, Simona Cruciani, who's with the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, is that in going through this process, what have been some of the challenges, or what are some of the approaches that we might try to take? And this is where I'll end the presentation. So presumably, all religious traditions have some kind of resource for trying to be involved in the prevention of violence, right? So for temporal peace, in the sense of that which is in the here and now, right? The temporal kind of linear time which we all experience, or whether that be in some kind of more metaphysical way, this idea of even like a scatological peace, right? But there's typically resources within religious traditions for social justice issues, right? Or for the promotion of peaceful coexistence. And so then you're able then to try to use some moral exemplars within those traditions. You can look at different texts and principles and individual practices within those communities, right, as a way of having some kind of resource for moving forward. And this is especially important if we're talking about these intra-religious dialogues, right, this way of how do we within our communities try to help make sure that within our own ranks that people aren't radicalized. So for instance, even though you may have conflicts between religious organizations or between religious traditions in conflicts, one thing that would be really helpful is to actually try to equip people who are in religious traditions how to help their fellow clergy, right, or their fellow parishioners, how can they help keep them from radicalizing, right, as opposed to always looking across the aisle, right, at the other religious tradition and trying to figure out how to get along with them, right, as opposed to let's look within our own ranks. And so challenges at this approach. Well, one is that, again, there are often local contexts and there are even different sects of different religious traditions that can make it difficult to carry out some of the actions that the reports indicate. So for instance, I already talked about political and government alliances. Sometimes there can actually be historical grievances or disconnects between religious principles and actions that vary across teachings within particular communities. Probably one of the greatest examples of this, and this is something that always shocks my students, but I have to kind of remind my students that religious traditions are practiced by people, right? And in that sense, almost nothing should shock you. But in looking at what's currently happening in Burma and Myanmar, it's hard for my students to kind of wrap their minds around the idea that the 969 movement, exists, right? That you could have Buddhists, right, who are involved in violence, right? And so it's very important, I think, for us to understand that the Buddhism that we may teach in the classroom and the Four Noble Truths, right, that gets actualized and mixed with cultures and other priorities in other parts of the world that makes it hard to kind of generalize and just look at the resources within Buddhism as a way forward for peace, right? There are a lot of other complicated kind of contextual factors that are a part of that. And then last, and I mentioned this earlier before, is the challenge of complicity, right? So if you're relying on the moral authority, and this gets cited by everybody, right? Why do we want to involve religious actors? There's usually two reasons. One is because they have a kind of moral sway or authority within their communities, and two is because they can quickly mobilize people, right? In the sense that, you can get your parishioners or you can get the faithful within your community, perhaps to move very quickly on something. And so these are the reasons that are often cited. Two other challenges are that there are often norms that might impede the actualization of some of these recommendations. So for instance, one of the criticisms, again, of the FES process and of the document that was a result of that, the Plan of Action for Religious Actors, is that it reads as though if we just get more women into positions of leadership, all would be much better. But it's ignoring the fact that within some of these religious traditions, that's nearly impossible with the way things exist as of now. And that's an unrealistic expectation of many of these religious traditions. So this is one of the challenges that we face. There are also issues with things like religious defamation laws, as well as issues around gender and sexuality and other disenfranchised groups that sometimes makes it difficult for them to rally all the people within their communities for issues of human rights. So there's this understanding, and this was from an earlier recommendation, is that part of genocide prevention and resiliency is protecting human rights. Well, you sometimes have religious traditions which are at odds with some of these kind of universal human rights that the document wants many of these religious traditions to uphold and to further. And then last, it's really hard to substantiate the effectiveness of many of these interactions. And so, in general, I also work with genocide prevention more generally, which is, imagine this. So you have all these factors, and there are a lot of them, all these models that help us predict, this is where genocide may happen. There are so many false positives that register because we have all these factors, say like a political event or an election that's coming up or economic depression that are predictors for genocide. But there's so many countries where all those predictors exist, but a genocide never erupts. And so it can be very difficult to figure out, well, how well is this model working for us then, right? And what are those perhaps indicators where it does erupt? Maybe that's where we need to be looking. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why we started involving ourselves in religious actors, trying to figure out, could this be part of that scenario, right? Is this one of the elements that we may be missing? But at the same time, it's so hard to measure whether or not, because this particular religious actor or tradition got involved in this particular moment within a potential kind of continuum of genocide, that specifically led to the fact that the genocide didn't happen, right? You can't draw that exact kind of corollary. So in some ways, it could be very challenging to figure out how substantiating the effect, how are we going to measure, right? How are we going to try to figure out the effectiveness of this kind of protocol and involving these actors, other than this intuitive sense that it's a good idea? The last thing that I'll share with you in that regard is that I was reading a piece about Bosnia-Herzegovina and about a lot of the reconciliation efforts that are happening there. And one thing that's interesting, and again, this goes back to the challenge of involving religious actors and kind of the measurability and the effectiveness of it, exactly maybe how efficacious may this kind of move be, is that despite the fact that it may not be quote unquote measurable, there are many people in a report that came out again about Bosnia-Herzegovina, and despite the fact that religion was a very salient part of that particular conflict with the Serbian Orthodox Church, is that many people said they thought, this is a survey that was done, is that most people thought that religious actors, more than politicians, had a role to play in building peaceful societies and in fomenting reconciliation, even though some of those same religious actors were actually involved in the genocide. So there is this kind of persistent belief amongst people, despite the fact that churches or mosques or other religious organizations or individuals may have been involved in some kind of genocide, that there's still this kind of holdout belief that they somehow are key to being able to build just societies. And also trying to train people so far as to being resilient to genocide or not being, I'm sure we all heard this language, not being bystanders, right? In a lot of this kind of training, one thing that's also really interesting, and again, still the idea persists that religious actors are an important element of genocide prevention, is that most people, when they cite why they may have helped someone during a genocide, they don't cite their religious beliefs. Guess what they cite? Having been a person who was also part of a minority group who was persecuted, right? Or, actually a close second, is actually their nationality, right? Why did you help? I did it because I'm French. That's why I did it, right? So it's usually not religious belief that many people are citing as a reason why they might have acted in interfering in a genocide. So again, given those kinds of stats and research, it makes for a very interesting milieu so far as how we might try to understand how to involve religious actors and the kind of effectiveness that they actually may have. So where I'll leave you is with this. So as much as I think it's a good idea to try to involve as many people as possible in genocide prevention and in forecasting, and even though I think there is a place and could be a place for religious actors in doing that, unfortunately, without the political will, right, without people who are willing to actually put up the resources and to actually dedicate the resources that are needed in order to build just societies or to prevent genocide, I'm afraid that religious actors aren't going to have that big a role to play. Because once a genocide is underway, it's nearly impossible to stop, right? So the key is not in trying to stymie or intervene. The key is then trying to prevent one happening in the first place. And again, it can be very hard to determine what those factors are, but at the same time, we have inklings of what they may be. Again, going back to this false positive concept, if you look at the ones, some of the situations where all those factors existed, but a genocide didn't erupt, right? That's been one kind of fruitful way of looking at this. And that often does involve things like a lack of sectarian violence, right? That could be one of the factors that can be built into why genocide may not occur. But at the same time, again, in looking at that, the fact that a lack of sectarian violence often is one of the elements that's present in places that have these factors that we think are risk factors where genocide doesn't happen, I think it is important to continue to think about how we might involve religious actors in this kind of effort. So this is what we call, and it's kind of moving to what we call an epidemiological model, right? Like this public health model, whereby you try to understand the spread, for instance, of particular types of ideology, right? Or you try to understand how different factors might trigger an outbreak, right? So this has also been part of the approach. So moving away from all these kind of false positives, going to more, kind of more epidemiological approach, and then perhaps involving religious actors who are on the ground, right, and can often see some of these things happening as part of how we might bring this approach to fruition. So there are lots of reasons, I think, to be hopeful, but I think we're still, again, in the kind of nascent stages of how this might actually work out. And thus far, it seems as though there's a long way to go. But nonetheless, there does seem to be this recent interest in religious actors and genocide prevention, and so we'll see kind of where things go. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
So I'm going to now ask Daryl Jacoin from MLT Aikins, the sponsor of this lecture, to host the Q&A session. And so over to you, Daryl.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I guess I should ask anyone in the audience have a question they'd like to lead off with?
Oh, to pass around. Yeah, there's always like that, at least that 5-minute lag, to kind of take in what just happened, and then formulate a question. So take your time. I'm very comfortable with silence. So you have a question here? Okay.
It's more an observation than a question. Thank you for your conference. You may know that the number 2 of the Holy See, which is in charge of the relations between the Holy See and the states, is a woman. So this is something that perhaps should be mentioned as for the Catholic Church as a kind of step forward in that sense.
Thank you.
The other thing is, it seems to me that all the documents from the United Nations have a specific audience, as you say. They're addressing the states. So if we look at the religions as institutions, perhaps the only one which has a kind of a statute as an entity in the international community is the Catholic one. Perhaps others have, but on a different way. So how such a document would be effectively addressing the leaders, there is something which is structurally not working. So I would think that the kind of those documents are addressed to the state, and the state then have to disseminate that in a way. But religion as such, as institutions, are not entities of the international community according to international law. So
you're kind of wondering how that relationship works? Yeah, so you do have, because of course the Catholic Church is so institutionalized and it's a transnational, kind of presence, they are often involved in some of, for instance, like relief effort, Catholic relief services, right? So they have such a huge presence. But what's interesting, when this plan was unveiled, there's also like the liaison to the UN from the Holy See who indicated before praising the document, said, we cannot support everything in this document, right? Even though they had been intimately involved with it. And so even those who are intimately involved with it can't seem to get on board with everything that's in that document. But then second, it is meant to not so much target states, even though that's what the document ends up doing. It really was meant, I think, to capitalize on many of the grassroots efforts that people had already been making, right? So kind of going away in some ways from that top-down model and then trying to look at grassroots efforts and how to coalesce and give them the training that they needed in order to be able to enact change with maybe some assistance from other kind of organizations. And so that seemed to be the direction they were trying to go in some ways. Yeah. Thank you. And then I believe we had a question here.
No question.
No
I just
question.
wanted to say that was awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I can go home now. Bye.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Well, the question I have is to find out how do you, if you look at the word peace itself, in spite of its positive connotation, it's not something that is easily graspable. I want to ask, with respect to religion and religion organizations, don't you think that the understanding of peace that some of these religions project are such that tend to promote their own interest rather than a broader, kind of interest? So wouldn't that constitute a kind of challenge, to peace building in itself, if it is the case that the understanding of peace by these various religious institutions cannot be very well relied on?
So there's no doubt that, and this was actually one of the problems that came out of this whole process, was that there are some people, to be honest, weren't even quite sure why they were there, right? So there was this kind of breakdown of the religious actors that were coming to these meetings, kind of weren't sure why they were there, and they weren't all able to get on the same page about what they were doing. And some of that may have been things like, well, what do we mean when we talk about involving women in differently? What do we mean when we talk about building resilient community, right? So there was a lot of, I think, talk about how we get on the same page about that. So far as having different ideas of peace, I think this was meant to be what we call like that Rawlsian kind of overlapping consensus concept, which is although people may have different ideas about peace, eschatological peace, right, like, kind of temporal peace, that I think they were kind of just shooting for that bare minimum overlap, which is the idea of an absence of tensions, right, an absence of kind of active warfare or active tensions. I think was what they were all operating with eventually, even if they might have different reasons for having different concepts of peace or even different motivations for wanting to promote peace. I think there was this at least thin, and we see this, for instance, in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right, where you have people from different religious traditions come together who want to at least agree on a thin concept of what they're trying to do, even if their religious motivations and texts, might bring them to the table and from different directions. So I think that's kind of what we're working with here. Yeah.
Thank you for a very engaging presentation.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question. When we look at, like, example, Rwanda and Kenya, we see that when it comes to religious institutions and the government approach to religion, like in Rwanda, the government is accused of replacing religious leaders, churches, with Tutsis who would more favor a messaging that the government would, want to hear. And it said under prevention of the genocide, based on the genocidal laws, as well as in Kenya, they're accused of killing religious leaders that are considered, rogue. My question is, obviously the governments are trying to find a way to deal with the situation. And I'm just thinking that in terms of peace building, I'm wondering where was the government in this discussion? And I do like the idea of religious leaders, taking a lead in terms of the discussion. But I'm reminded too that these religious leaders have, or the few, they have been, well, their radical view is not the sentiment of the general. So then the question is, why do they also find an appeal with a certain sect within society to get a genocide to actually happen? So my question is, how can we get the government and religious leaders to really work together without infringing on the rights of religion, the freedom of religion?
Right, yeah. And so this was part of the issue, and where kind of government kind of makes its way into the conversation, is that there is concern about the relationship and whether or not some of these recommendations can actually get any footing, depending on the kind of relationship that perhaps religious organizations and institutions have to the government or to the state. And so there is concern, for instance, with persecuting those who may be involved with actions that might go against the state. There's question about them being in collusion with each other, right? Especially if it feels as though it might benefit their religious institution and actually going along and not being somebody that might be critical of the state. So for instance, you have situations where just out of sheer protection, right, you might have a particular religious organization or institution that goes along with the genocidal ideology of a government. And if you think about it, when we think about like the pervasiveness of influence of particular organizations on our lives, it's the government, and then usually the second largest institution are religious ones, right? So if both the religious institutions and influence and the government are in collusion with each other, it's a very difficult kind of nut to crack, right? And so the government is involved, and in this particular instance with some of these recommendations, the government's all over the document. It's actually really not that much about religious actors, because much of what they're hoping to accomplish, the religious actors can't accomplish on their own, right? And so this is one of the reasons why the document is considered unrealistic, is that because it's expecting way too much of what these religious actors can actually do without the cooperation of the state. Yeah.
Another question here, just last row.
For sure. So you're okay for me? I think one.
It's weird. I can just see you. I don't need the mic. But I just,
Sure.
Given that a lot of genocide is correlated with sort of forced migration throughout history, and that there's a lot of regions in the world where the idea of genocide exists because of the fact that many of these groups have been displaced, how do you then approach talking to a government or a state actor in advocating for people who the state and the government and the religious don't really believe should be there in the first place? And I think that that's really pressing, especially now, given situations happening around the world. And when you were talking about that and sort of like the excuses, I don't want to say excuses, but the reasons for genocide, othering being amongst them.
Right.
How do you approach that academically and also practically when discussing that? Because these people feel like they don't have skin in the game. They don't have anything at stake, and so we can just sort of forget about them because they're not really our problem. Like with, for example, the Uyghur population in China. Or like you said, the Rohingya.
Rohingya, yeah.
So how do you approach that?
Yeah, so that's actually a really tough question to answer, and I guess the best that I can offer is that, and unfortunately, I'm not quite sure how terribly effective this has been, and this is a point that I made at the end, which is you have people who are signatories, right, to things like conventions that are supposed to then come to the aid, right, of other countries whenever they may be facing a threat. And so you have, for instance, in what was late January, I believe, when the International Criminal Court indicated, right, that Myanmar had to take steps to prevent the Rohingya from genocide. But I don't know if that's actually going to happen, right? That's a top-down kind of thing. So yeah, so if the people within a particular nation state are either unwilling, to help those that are there, or are actively somehow engaged, then that's supposed to then activate other international actors for intervention. But as we can see, usually for reasons of, like, say, political expediency, right, or people don't often get involved. And so, yeah, so that's a really hard one to answer, because it seems as though up to this point it has been appealing to these, like, things like the United Nations, right, and to other organizations, but then we've seen how states who are signatories to these, treaties aren't actually getting involved, right? So, yeah, so it is difficult. I'm not quite sure how we do handle that. Did I see another question in the back? Oh, no. No, I think you're great. Oh, okay. Oh, yes. We want this for posterity, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Kate. That was very enlightening. I enjoyed the opportunity to hear you speak.
Thank you.
Um,
I know Andrew, by the way.
Yeah.
I paid him to say that. Yeah.
As you know, genocide scholars like to talk a lot about the definition of
Yes.
genocide.
Yes.
And-
Religion and genocide. Lots of definitions.
So the United Nations Genocide Convention definition is, of course, a contested one.
It is.
One in which Lemkin's article on cultural genocide was removed from. So most of the techniques of cultural genocide are not considered
in.
within that. Now, those would seem fairly important when we think about the sorts of activities that religions engage in, that particularly around when we think about how dogma and exclusivity might affect other groups with whom they're in relation with. So I'm wondering, to what extent does this the framing around the UNGC, in what ways does this potentially limit the discussion of the role of religious actors in
gotcha.
genocide?
So you're wondering if, because of the limitations of the definition, if in some way it has this kind of built-in way of excluding the kind of help that religious actors could lend to genocide prevention?
Both the type of help they could, both in terms of their own assessment of their own participation and complicity when we think of religion's role in perpetrating genocide.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, what follows from that is thinking about preventing that sort of, those cultural techniques in which religions are often, not often, but are occasionally
sometimes a part.
complicit
Right.
in.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, and you're absolutely right, this is a very contested definition, right? Political persecution's left out, right? I mean, it's all cultural genocide's left out. But I think what's important about what you're saying is that when we look at actually prosecuting people, right? So this has been part of the problem with the definition, is that not only does it seem very limited in the kinds of people that it protects, but it's also very difficult to prosecute anybody legally because of this intent requirement, right? So there are all these little limitations. I think another part of that's what you were mentioning, which is I wonder if some of them don't see their complicity in these acts because there's such an emphasis, again, from a prosecutorial point of view, on deaths, right, on people dying, and on a large number of people dying, right, as evidence of genocide, versus this cultural genocide, which Lemkin also had in mind, which is tantamount to a kind of death whereby an entire culture has then been erased. And because of this emphasis on high number of deaths, perhaps you're right, the kind of religious element gets lost because of the role that they often play in kind of cultural deaths that's not highlighted in the convention. Does that kind of answer your question?
And of course,
Yeah.
I'm approaching this from a Canadian perspective, where
Right.
we're thinking about the ways in which the churches in Canada have had to grapple with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and thinking about the ways in which they've been complicit in the attempted destruction of Indigenous peoples here in Canada,
Right.
and how to move forward in preventing that in the future. So.
In the future, yeah. The other point that I think that you brought up, I'm glad you said too, is that I was looking through, so as many of you know, for those of you who've done a dissertation or in the middle of doing a dissertation, you're trotting through all this paperwork, right? You're trying to figure out this document, is there anything in here that might be helpful to me? And one thing that was interesting, I was looking at some transcripts from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, right? So as many of you know, that tribunal and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda were these two ad hoc courts that were put together, the only two after the Nuremberg trials, before we got what's now the standing International Criminal Court, right? So before the International Criminal Court existed, I was looking through these transcripts. And one of them was, and one of the ways in which they actually tried to prove that in Srebrenica, that there was a genocide, was a destruction of religious monuments and religious, and which is part of cultural heritage, right? The destruction of buildings and places of worship. So it actually got me thinking about that too, when you make that mention, yeah.
Actually, Andrew asked a much.
Yeah. For posterity.
That's such a booming voice. But so Andrew asked a much better version of the question I was going to ask, but I have a similar concern, and
Okay.
I want to make a comment, and then I'm going to ask you to just extend your response to Andrew a little bit,
Okay.
specifically with respect to groups.
Okay.
And the identity of groups.
Okay.
But the comment I wanted to make actually had to do with that, the title, preventing a hell on earth, right? In the
Averting hell on
power,
earth,
or avoiding
yeah.
hell on earth. Partly because it reminds me, anytime I hear that locution, I'm reminded of Michael Walzer's discussion of the phrase war is hell, right?
Yeah.
And Walzer's point is, of course, war is much worse than hell because at least in hell, everybody who's there deserves to be there. And I wonder if there isn't actually a kind of deterministic element to that particular nomenclature in that title that suggests something of the narrowness of the vision, the moral vision that's at work. So anyway, that's a comment.
Gotcha.
But the question really is that question about groups. Because, okay, we can say that, and I'm a Lemkinian as well, and we can say that the Genocide Convention leaves out all that stuff about culture, which is true, but it also defines groups so narrowly so that it was a religious, ethnical, racial, national group, right? Like there are other groups.
Right.
And those group definitions tend to be the kinds of definitions that are assigned from without. They're not organically determined from within.
Right, this is Shaw,
So
Martin Shaw's point, yeah.
right. So the question of how we know a group when we see one is also important.
Right.
I guess I'm just wondering why you're staying within the convention, partly because I think the Rome Statute gives you somewhere else to go, and then partly because I think the philosophical and political and moral issues with the convention as written, as a boardroom compromise, that document was an incredibly political document. Like, why would you put your eggs in that basket?
Yeah. So I think part of the, and thank you for the question for both of you. So the point that Dr. Mauro is making is one that Martin Shaw, for instance, has made, which is this idea of when we talk about who constitutes a group, often it's by the perpetrators, right? They're the ones that determine that group, whether or not it actually matches up with anything that the group themselves might label themselves as. And of course, from a legal perspective, this is one of the reasons why that's important, right? Because they have to show that there was a group that was persecuted. The reasons why I'm putting my eggs in this basket, at least for the time being, is because I actually am interested in holding people responsible. And because this is what we have on the books now, I'm trying to work within that framework until we have something better. So I'm not saying that I couldn't advocate for a change. I certainly could see that happening. But again, for the time being, it's what we're working with. And so because I have an interest in prevention, but I also have an interest in prosecution, and that's why. Because that's the definition we're working with the ICC.
Just before Robert does. Would you like a little bit of water?
Sure.
Yeah, kind of hidden there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm wondering if you could shed some light from your experience on, is there a categorical distinction, something qualitative, between, on the one hand, those religious voices that cater to propaganda and lend their authority to the incitement of violence, and on the other hand, the political or nationalistic voices that likewise incite hate. Is there something different or distinct about the religious voices that have a kind of gravity or authority? And I'm thinking of, religions considering something beyond this lifetime, speaking in terms of heaven, hell, immortal souls, cosmic struggles, and these kinds of things. Is there something qualitatively different, and even maybe more dangerous, you could say, about the religious voice that lends its authority to the incitement of violence?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. So one of the things, and this is a point that, for instance, like Campbell has made in The Myth of Religious Violence. This is a Blackwell kind of anthology that came out. And this question often comes up, right? Is there something specific about religion? And so one of the ideas that comes up are two things. So one of them is because, yes, religious traditions often do attend to things that are transcendent, right? Things that are just kind of beyond the everyday, that it can sometimes heighten the stakes, right, of what's going on here, right? So this is going back to like the cosmic threat, right, kind of idea. The second one is, again, going back to this idea of moral authority, right? So that people who have religious voices are often ascribed, sometimes deservedly not, right? Ascribed this kind of authority that can have an effect in ways that, say, maybe a politician or somebody couldn't. So in those two ways, it definitely often comes up. But one thing that you said that I should probably mention too is that even though I'm obviously kind of teasing out religion as a specific tradition, of course it interacts with lots of other factors. And one of those is that you also sometimes have ethno-religious identities, right? So people whose religion and nationality are melded together, right? And so that provides a whole nother kind of synergistic kind of effect. So yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that I wanted to mention. But yeah, but there is, I think, this kind of growing sense that there may be a particularity to religious language that goes beyond just the everyday. David Little is another person who's made this comment, whereby sometimes a problem can seem so intractable, right? Like I said, like we're in an economics, spin or something like this, that you need extraordinary circumstances in order to overcome it, right? And those extraordinary circumstances can be things like, killing people, and that one way to kind of justify that kind of extraordinary action is through the extraordinary language that we sometimes see in religious rhetoric. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed the presentation. In your, based on the talk, I think you're co-opting religious leaders to prevent genocide. I think that might be possible in the Catholic Church because there's one central body that controls everything. Whereas if you look at the other religions, they don't have a central body. And many of those religious organizations rely on the state to support themselves. So it is in their best interest to be in collusion with the politicians to be in power.
Right.
So under those circumstances, how do you get the cooperation of the religious bodies? Because they're not answerable to anybody.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so in my presentation, I'm saying this is one of the problems moving forward, is that because, and this goes back to your question, is how much can they actually do without the cooperation of the government? And then if they do something that is seen as not being in the best interests of government, then they could potentially face persecution, right? So I think that this is a really difficult kind of situation moving forward, because even though they're targeting religious actors, much of what the documents ask them to do, they can't do on their own without the cooperation of government. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One unofficial, informal question.
Sure.
Will you take a picture with me?
Sure.
And then I gotta go.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
We have time for one more.
But that was totally official and formal.
I'm fine.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
First level.
Gubby.
Not re-asking the other one.
You heard him.
What you talked about really does seem like an impossible task, just from face value. And what I think is interesting is you mentioned that if genocide can be prevented, there's an equal responsibility between actors of faith and like a grassroots sort of approach to it, and also creating what the UN has, which is sort of like this kind of process for the states to go, all right, this is where we have to approach this.
Right.
And which do you think, in the eventual prevention of genocide, which do you think would be more effective? Because what you're saying is, all right, here are the guidelines, these are the guidelines we have to work within, but realistically, when it comes to the on-the-ground prevention, using Bosnia as an example, or using, like nationalism or empathy of being a minority, which do you think is ultimately going to have the most effect of actually preventing a genocide?
Right,
The
yeah.
grassroots approach, or creating a statute by which states, fingers crossed, will follow?
Right, yeah. And so I guess, so just in my humble kind of estimation, it seems as though, especially if we do look at some of those circumstances under which maybe religious actors have been successful, it's usually been through grassroots efforts. Yeah, so I think part of what, again, the documents are trying to do, or like the UN's trying to do, is that they were trying to identify people who are already leaders and involved in some of these grassroots efforts and already kind of had this bend, toward peace, and trying to give them tools to help them do that job even better, was kind of, I think, what their ideal was. But as we mentioned before, and kind of relatedly, is that, yeah, this kind of top-down approach whereby you're looking to others outside, it hasn't really worked terribly well. And so I think that it's going to, moving forward, I think that relationship somehow needs to get kind of reconfigured. And again, right now, there isn't really a good mechanism for a lot of those grassroots efforts to be able to report out And again, and do you even want them reporting out? Like, because again, that they become targets, so yeah, so I think, again, there's this kind of shared sense that because we can't pin down this is the exact reason why genocide didn't happen, is that we're kind of throwing everything against the wall, right? Which is, you're trying to look for as many possible outlets as possible to kind of build societies that you hope will be resilient toward genocidal ideology once it's taken up. And some of that does have to do with things like economic stability, right? I mean, some of those are things that do help build genocidal resilient communities, and religious actors can play a role in helping kind of shore up kind of civil society, right? So for instance, oftentimes we see this is that religious organizations are involved in a lot of like social services, right? And so they kind of help fill the gap of where states, and government, and that kind of work can kind of help when it comes to rhetoric of that person's responsible for you not having a job, right? When you try to make sure that people economically feel secure, that can help, kind of butt up against any kind of ideology the state's trying to promulgate as a way of getting them to persecute a particular group of people. So that might be another kind of grassroots way in which, religious actors are helpful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Daryl, I just want to thank you very much for being here, and please bring back to your partners at TDK? MLT, I'll get it. Take back the message to Aikins that we appreciate the support. So thank you very much, Daryl. Now, I'd like to call upon Mame Peterson and Manisha Shah to come forward and bring a few words of appreciation to Dr. Temoney. These are two graduate students in the Peace and Conflict Studies program, and they're very much involved with the Student Association of PACs, so please come forward.
Thank you so much, Chris, for introducing us. Sorry about that.
No worries.
On behalf of PACS and on behalf of PACSA, I would like to express a very big thank you to Dr. Kate Temoney for sharing such an insightful and thought-provoking lecture. And I'm sure that many of your recommendations and the discussions we had would help many of us in our research and also in my term paper personally. So thank you so much. And may I please request Mame to present the gift as a vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this a picture moment? Thank you. Thank you very much. And congratulations again to you, and thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Shall I open it, or?
Sure.
Okay. So, lovely tote bag. Oops. Oh, excellent. If you want to make an academic happy, give them books. So, Picking Up the Pieces, Residential School Memories and the Making of the Witness Blanket, and Broken Circle, The Dark Legacy of Indian Residential Schools, a memoir. Thank you very much.
Okay. Dr. Temoney will be meeting with the graduate students tomorrow, as well as we'll be touring our human rights museums. So it's quite a visit. So we very much appreciate this. I want to thank the students, also the graduate students, for the remarks, and all of you in our audience here this evening. I also want to, on behalf of our community, to express our deep thanks to Jason Brennan. Every time we have an event, He handles everything. He never seems fazed, and we try to push the envelope each time, and he still makes it through. But anyway, thank you, Jason, for your work, and also to the PACS program and the Mauro Institute for the work and coordinating this. So finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Temoney for her presence here this evening. So thank you very much, and good evening.